This is War Junk, the podcast, based on the TV series, produced by Northern Sky Entertainment. Roll the opening.
I'm Professor David O'Keefe.
And I'm history buff and filmmaker Wayne Abbott.
Together, we travel the globe searching for war junk.
Remnants, artifacts, anything left over on the battlefields.
Some big, some small,
All with a story to tell.
and a mystery or two to solve along the way.
This is War Junk, the podcast, with Professor David O'Keefe and me, Wayne Abbott.
Ooh, the music.
The music. I always still love our opening.
Yeah. Oh my God. Well, here we are now, episode 4.
Yeah, episode 4. We're getting there. We're building up our library, but
Yep.
episode 4 is going to be a continuation from 3. Having Stijn from Pond Farm on was amazing, and there's just so much story to tell. But before we bring Stijn on, we were focusing on the Ypres Salient. Maybe put it in historical context of just how much fighting happened here in this area in World War I.
I think, the one thing we talked about in the last episode was the fact that there was, 4 solid years of fighting. I mean, the Germans show up in this area in October 14, and the fighting continues right into the last day of the war. And, sadly, there are 2 million men roughly from all sides who lose their life just in this area. And one of the central areas was where we are, where we were talking about, or what we were talking about last week, which was Pond Farm, where Stijn lives. It's an incredible place. And the other thing for our purposes was the layers of archaeology. In other words, you have artifacts from 1914 running right through from 1918. So depending if you can identify them, you will be able to tell a snippet of what the fighting was like in Flanders at a particular time. And that's one of the most amazing parts, I think, of Pond Farm.
Yeah, and this is just to let everybody know the stories that we tell and the images that you will see. And if you're viewing this on War Junk TV on YouTube, you'll see the images, or you'll hear the stories on all the other podcast apps. But this is footage actually not from War Junk. We were dealing with a British network who wanted a similar show. And it was a pilot that never took off, but it was a pilot called Buried War. So it was Buried War Passchendaele. And we were wondering what we were going to do. And we contacted Stijn at Pond Farm. The amazing thing, we were able to do something extraordinary to shoot Stijn and his family as they were digging up their pond, giving us the opportunity to look for war artifacts. So unless you were in England in the UK area, you would have seen Buried War Passchendaele. For the rest of the world, this footage has never been seen before, and none of the stories, and it's extraordinary. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, please listen. It's great. Try to get over to War Junk TV to actually see the visuals, because it is amazing what we experienced, right?
Worldwide broadcast premiere.
on War Junk, the podcast. So we're going to bring Stijn on, and we'll go into the story of digging up one of the 2 ponds on Pond Farm. Here we go.
Hi,
Hey.
Dave.
So
Hello.
I think you heard our intro there, because we filmed for one of our earlier shows in the War Junk series on Pond Farm. And then we had the opportunity, as we were developing a different series called Buried War, we came back to Pond Farm. So maybe set up what you and your family wanted to do prior to us arriving and what the whole objective was.
So on the farm, we had 2 ponds, and one of the ponds needed to be cleaned out because every year, with all the raining here in Belgium, the ponds, they fall in. And then we do not have enough water for our crops. So it was very necessary to clean that pond for the first time. And of course, I was very excited to do this and together with you guys, because I knew there was stuff in the ground. And we did found some nice stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, don't give it away just yet. So, but yeah, because let's just go back. This is a good time because we didn't say this in the first one. It was called Pond Farm by the British.
Yeah, Pond Farm is a British code name. So the British they gave every farm another name so that the Germans and the British could not know from each other. So Pond Farm was easy, of course. That was because of the two ponds, and those two ponds were here already before the war. And I can find them on maps since 1700s, so they are quite old.
Wow.
And they survived the war. They were still here. And if I look on the aerial photographs, you can still see them in the middle, just between all the shell craters.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. Didn't know it went all the way back. So I'm going to I'm going to repeat this a lot. I'm going to roll a clip right now where you show Dave and I the pond the way it looked prior to it being dug up. So I just want people who are watching this to visually see what the pond looked like, and then we will then pick up in progression of what happened after. So, okay, so here's the pond the way it looked.
There are 2 ponds on Pond Farm, hence the name given by the British soldiers during the war. We must go and check out the site of this potential great dig.
So this is the pond you're planning to clean out then?
Yes, indeed, yeah. Because my grandfather, he cleaned it somewhere in the 60s for the first time after the war.
Okay, but one would assume he probably wasn't as thorough as we could be today.
Yeah, he didn't went so deep. They didn't have such big cranes in that time. So now we're gonna make it deeper. We're gonna drive in it with the crane.
Really?
And we're gonna make it bigger, yeah.
So there's a chance then that you're gonna be able to go down deeper than anybody has ever been on this farm.
Yes, indeed.
So right into the legendary blue clay from here.
Yeah, all the blue clay, the mud, you will smell it.
So that's what that pretty little pond looked like.
Yeah, I was very excited to do that. If I see my face, I was very excited.
Well, we were excited because Dave mentioned it. So Dave, why don't you explain it a bit? We get to see it in this next scene, but talk about this legendary blue clay.
Well, that's the thing. Whenever you're reading about the battlefields on the Western Front, and they always talk about mud and blood, and particularly in Flanders. And Flanders was known for having this blue clay that, when you read the accounts, soldiers who were there talk about it being different than any other mud they've ever faced. It's much more treacherous. Well, of course, you don't really notice that until you indeed experience it. And that was something that we did firsthand.
Yeah. Well, why don't I show then? This is really the first few scoops when the dig began. And again, if you're just listening to it, you have to close your eyes and think of big scoops of black goo being, dumped on the field around it, and you hear it. I mean, we actually captured the sound of it. The people watching it on War Junk TV, you will visually see how spectacular this was. And we just loved filming it. So this is the beginning of the dig on Pond Farm.
The scene opens up with a large excavator taking its first scoop.
But when this excavator got going, it totally changed the landscape of the pond. I mean, it was scoop after scoop after scoop of this gooey, mucky mud. I mean, this blue clay was everywhere.
And it was amazing to see the blue clay come up and then just slop down. I had never expected to see that kind of hue. And it was something that you read about in the history books about the Battle of Passchendaele. Well, it's amazing to actually see the Flanders mud. I mean, we always hear about this, the blue clay. And it's amazing to actually see it for the first time like this. I mean, so many stories of the men who fought here talking about their existence being defined by the blue clay. Now to see it on the surface.
Wow.
Yeah. What was it? The professional term you used? Mucky mud? Was it? Yeah.
I think if you're listening to this, you must. That was just slop bad. If you're just listening to it, I think it sounds just this. I think you can imagine what it was like. But Stijn, what were you feeling, or at that moment where you saw this blue clay just being, slopped basically all over your field?
Well, it's a shame you can't smell it because the smell was so. Yeah. I can't describe it. Yeah, but the mud was sticking everywhere where we were walking through. Yeah, it must have been the same, I think, on 31 July. I think that must have been the same problem.
Yeah, I mean, that was the one thing, the impression it made on me was just how difficult it was to move. I mean, it's one thing going through a muddy field. It's going to be difficult. But this is like cement. This grabs you. It holds you. I mean, how many times do we lose our boots when we were just mucking around ourselves in it? I mean, here we are all these years later, 100 years later, and we're filming a TV show where, we're trying to work our way around. We're getting stuck. We have shovels and whatever else. We're not wearing greatcoats, carrying weapons, trying to move through this under fire with people being ripped apart around us. But, and it was so difficult to get through. And all the stuff, all the hell that these poor guys had to go through, and you add this to the mix.
Well, you see it in the photos. I mean, of course, there's not much moving or great moving footage, but you see it in the photos, especially in Passchendaele. Just the miles and miles of muck, and this is what we were experiencing that day. And I do have a clip of us when we first started trying to walk through it. Yeah. So what Dave was talking about, again, unless you're in the UK, this is never before seen. So this is really unique footage from our team. And here it is, us trying to walk through the blue clay of the Ypres Salient. The scene begins with the team gearing up to investigate the blue clay.
Even though part of the blue clay was dry, the other part was hell.
This is Flanders mud. I am already stuck.
It was almost comical for us trying to get through the blue clay.
Nope, not gonna work. Just when we thought we were going to be digging on dry land, we ended up still sinking into the mud. Now, of course, instead of being sloppy, it was now sticky. It was like glue.
When there were times when Dave and Craig and I and our crew just couldn't get out of the blue clay.
We're going to lose the entire crew. Yo! Okay. Never imagined that the Flanders clay could be like this. You hear the stories about it from 1917, but until you experience that, you have no clue.
There you go. I mean, I don't know how they fought in it, but that's not, if you're listening to it, all it was images of Dave, myself, the crew members. Our boots were getting stuck. Our feet were coming out of our boots. We could not move in this stuff.
We needed duck boards.
Yeah, that would have helped.
Yeah, I need some duck boards. But that is a great example right there.
Now you have the idea how difficult it is for us for farming just because of the clay. Every time when we have raining, it sticks to the tires of the tractor. If we want to walk on the field, it's almost impossible just because of the blue clay. The blue clay is only on 30 centimeters of depth. So yeah, it's really difficult. It's good for our potatoes. We have the best potatoes here in Belgium because of the blue clay. It's more,
Yeah, I guess the other thing too, of course, is, there were so many men who just disappeared, during the fighting. Obviously some of them were, victims of shells, but a lot of them were victims of this mud too. They either slipped off the duck boards and went into the water. And then you can imagine, I mean, it wasn't just a question of swimming around in water. You touch that blue clay and, it's not quicksand, but it's going to hold you. And that was the thing. I mean, you could see the if you were watching this, you could see the film footage of Wayne and I trying to help each other. And that was tough enough. Wow.
I can't imagine if I was in a retreat mode or we were in a retreat mode trying to get away from the enemy. You would just get stuck. But there's one advantage of the blue clay when it comes to artifacts, right, Stijn?
Well, it preserves the material that's still in the ground. So it shuts off the oxygen, and then the time is still. And if you find then, by example, a shell in the blue clay, then it's in a very perfect condition.
Well, that's a good transition into this scene, and what you're going to see is Craig, Mitchell, and Stijn when they came across a World War I shell. And you remember this is 100 years. And we were there filming basically at the time that the battle was raging in Passchendaele 100 years before. So the shell that you're about to see is literally 100 years old. So let's roll this scene and then we'll talk about the preservation of that the blue clay has on artifacts.
Okay, what'd you find?
I was just extracting myself out of this mud. I was up to here. You can see I almost went up to my knee deep. As I stumbled over, I looked down and I think we've got something pretty sinister just here.
Right in front of me, I could see that something brass was sticking out, and it was really, really shiny, so I knew that we were on for something pretty big.
If we have a look, there's this copper band here, which is pretty clear that it is a shell of some description, so...
We slowly worked away some of the mud that was around it, and it started to materialize that it was a big shell.
I don't really recognize this. Stijn, can you see what this is?
Be careful. I see 2 friction bands. So there's one here and one there, yeah.
That's quite unusual for it being such a large gap, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's a German one.
A German, you noticed that straight away.
More Austric.
This was a live World War I Austrian artillery shell, something that Stijn would tell us was very rare to find on Pond Farm.
It's a very rare shell because we don't find them so much, and also this one has never been fired before.
When Stijn pulls the shell out of the mud, there's another surprise.
Oh wow, look at that. Look at that.
You see the fuse is still on it, so you need to be very careful.
And is that the safety wire in there?
That's the safety cap.
Okay, so...
There were 2 things that made this really unique. First of all, you don't find Austrian ammunition in this part of the Western Front in any great quantity. So this made that a rare find in itself. But what also made it unique was that the safety pin was still in. This wasn't something that had been fired. This was something that was being prepped for firing.
That's it. They armed it. They put the fuse in it. It was lined up. It was getting ready to get fired off, but it never actually got to the breach.
The amazing part was when we started to clean it off a little bit, you could see just how well preserved it is.
I saw the brass part, and it was absolutely shiny. It looked like it had been made a few weeks ago.
I mean, I could zoom in to the top of the shell, and you can see the numbers 28, and you can see the ring which they would use to set the distance and how far it would fly. Every little mark was perfect.
And to think they'd been in the ground for 100 years plus or so, it really goes to show you just that clay, that lack of oxygen environment just really preserves anything that gets coated in that mud.
Wow.
I forgot just how, I mean, that shell didn't even look like it was a day old.
Yeah, I can't find any shell anymore like that. So they were really in a perfect condition. They were perfect, preserved in the mud, in the water. If I go searching with the metal detector, they are all completely rusted.
Yeah.
But like that.
It's what you normally find, right? Like the stuff that we saw in the first episode, that shell that you pulled out. Most of them have been rusted and they're deteriorating, but this thing was perfect.
Yeah, this thing was perfect, and it was not fired. And yeah, it has a reason, because the Germans, they were here on the farm. They had here their cannons to fire those shells. So it's normal to find an unfired shell like that. And it was an Austrian, so
Yeah, very rare find. Yeah, very rare find. Interesting. Do you still have the shell?
No. Every year I have to report those shells to the bomb disposal, and they are already gone.
And it's very important for people who are listening, okay, is that not only did the shell look perfect, but this safety pin that Dave was talking about, this is very weak metal that would rust away very easily. And you will see in the images when Stijn took it to the cage, and you see this thin piece of metal, it didn't rust at all. I mean, this blue clay preserved it 100%. So we were just amazed. And you can see the images now between the shell, this unique Austrian shell that we found in the mud, and all the other shells, which are rusted and corroded. So, I mean, this is why having this opportunity to dig on Pond Farm into the clay, it was unbelievable. And it wasn't just this shell. We came across countless artifacts that were in perfect condition. Another amazing scene that happened that day is that Craig, with his metal detector, got down into the actual pond. So I'm going to show, again, this never before seen footage, unless you're from the UK, of Craig going down into the pond and having an opportunity to search.
What we're really excited about today is we have the opportunity to get Craig down into the pond, deeper than anyone has ever been on this field since the war.
We were truly hoping that something incredible was still left at the bottom of the pond.
So I took the opportunity to search inside the pond itself. Every step was a challenge. I mean, I was sliding all over the place. It was really hard work. I was fortunate enough to brought my waterproof detector. This is waterproof to about 3 meters, 10 feet, so it's no problem getting this all splashed about.
I mean, it was incredible. I was there with Craig as we slipped and slid along the bottom of the pond. There was about a foot or so of water. You getting anything down there?
A few mixed signals, again, probably not worth digging them up. I was a little bit surprised because the main things I found at the bottom of the pond was just shrapnel. I was hoping to find a little bit bigger items than that, but pretty much everything down there was just shrapnel. I think what had happened is stuff at the bottom of the pool had already been pulled up and had been dumped up on the top.
But I was really hoping that he would get a major hit. That came when he checked the side of the pond.
As I started to reveal the item, the first thing I noticed was a real shine. Something caught my eye. It was a real bright color. Oh, wow. I continued to clean around it, and it soon became apparent that it was a fuse. It was in such lovely condition, it looked like it had just come from the factory. Wow, would you look at that? Well, it's a British. That's from an 18-pounder. Gonna try and give it a little bit more of a cleanup.
I mean, the last time this fuse saw daylight was probably the moment that shell exploded and the fuse was sent into the pond.
Look at that. Lovely. Last inspection, September 1916.
And then here we are, almost exactly 100 years later, pulling it out of the mud.
That's a lovely find. I'm really happy with that. Excellent condition.
Didn't have any rust on it. I mean, that's how you go through a process of cleaning up old fuses to make it look like that. Do you not?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and that's quite some work to do. But like that fuse that came from the pond, it was perfect. I didn't have to touch it anymore, and I still have it in my collection. Yeah, and that was an 18-pounder fuse, high explosive, so it explodes by impact.
Explode by impact, yeah. Now, the other thing we should probably take, again, caution people, if you're ever out in this area or any battlefield and you end up finding something, don't touch it. Just leave it there, call the authorities. And it's funny in Belgium because I guess a lot of people have done that over the years and have wanted to take stuff home. And sometimes when you go to get on a train in Belgium or France, you will actually see a sign saying in pictogram, do not bring these items onto the train. So, I mean, these, you can see, we're looking at it and it's a marvel to us because of all these years later, but you got to remember, these things can go boom even all these years later.
It's a good thing for people to be reminded of. I mean, when we do go out and we're working with people like Craig and Stijn and other diggers, there's a lot of experience there. So we always follow a pretty good protocol. With those shells that came out of the mud, you'll see a scene and images of Stijn carrying it to the cage. those were very stable, I think, at that point compared to a lot of the corroded explosives. But
also too, like you said, we do a lot of planning. We we make sure that everything is done in advance before we do it. And even though it kind of can be done, it appears to be done fast, it done almost cavalier on television. That's for television purposes. We're there to make it as entertaining and as possible. But at the same time, we also do our proper protocol in the back to make sure nobody gets hurt.
And the scenes are edited. I mean, a lot of the stuff that you see happens over hours, and sometimes we cut it down to minutes. But one of the things about Passchendaele, maybe one of you can talk about, is the amount of shells that were fired at the beginning of Passchendaele. Wasn't that one of the biggest barrages in history at the beginning of Passchendaele?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about hundreds of rounds per gun, and you're talking about thousands, a couple of, probably almost 2,000-3,000 guns that were in the area, double that for both sides, and they're just firing them consistently or constantly over each other. So it really is a storm of steel. There's no doubt about that. And then, of course, your farm is right center of that. I was about to say dead center, but, center of that. Well, it was probably appropriate. But that's just for Passchendaele in 1917. And then you add everything that happened up to 17. And then, of course, they're still fighting in 1918. Even though the Allies take it, it's still the front line.
And I think to go back, we didn't really set it up. The Battle of Passchendaele started on July 31st, 1917, and it lasted to, was it November, Stijn?
It was November, yeah. It was finished in November.
Yeah, and it's important before I play this scene, to understand that it started in July, end of July 31st, 1917, and we were really trying, while we were filming Buried War, we were hoping to find an artifact that we could connect directly with Passchendaele. And in one of our last scenes, when Dave was digging with Craig, we came across another fuse, and this one's a very special one. So here's one of the last scenes in Buried War where we do find an artifact that we can connect directly to the Battle of Passchendaele.
Ooh. Here we go. There we go. There it is. What do we got here? Super shiny again?
It was a fuse in perfect condition. But what made this one special was the date.
June 17, Passchendaele. This is it. This would have been inspected in June. The fighting was over here by August 22nd.
So there was no reason for another British shell to be landing in this area after that period.
You got it. One of the greatest expenditures of ammunition in the entire First World War happened here in support of the battle. So it's not surprising that you would see something that was minted in June of 1917 make it to the battlefield in time to take part in the opening salvos of Passchendaele. So if that's stamped June, this definitely is a Passchendaele fuse. Talk about a timestamp in history right there.
Yeah, that's the nicest thing. If you find something like that in a pond and you clean it, and then you can see all the small details on the artifacts, that's amazing. Most of the time I'm searching for a name, but if you can find a date like that, then indeed, then you can confirm the Third Battle of Passchendaele. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, here while we were doing this, I was quickly looking this up. 3,000 guns, 4.5 million shells just fired on the German defenses. So that's about one of the 4.5 million shells that were fired just on the opening day, or could have been for the opening day, could have been anywhere, but just on the opening day, 4.5 million shells were fired.
So this fuse we found that was dated, and the date is when it was stamped and basically ready for firing. To have this fuse dated in June and then fired, it would have been fired in and around that opening salvo, that opening days of Passchendaele, and then preserved perfectly in your pond, Stijn.
That's correct.
Just an amazing artifact. Absolutely amazing to actually get it dated. And again, what was so special about that is when you look at the layers of war that we've talked about, the fact that so many battles happened on Pond Farm, so many, it was handed over numerous times, to find actually something dated. And we didn't even have to clean it off, of course. I mean, we just had to clean the mud off. We didn't have to do any more cleaning. It was just perfectly preserved. So that would have been fired in probably the opening days of Passchendaele. And then we uncovered it all those years later.
Yeah, it really is amazing. I mean, we talk about this all the time, particularly as historians or archaeologists. We talk about primary sources, right? Things that were created at the time in question that you're studying. And of course, we're picking up all these little pieces. But if you step back, you realize the farm, Pond Farm, is the ultimate primary source in this area because of everything that you can find on there or in the ground that gives you that human story of what it was like to be there from 1914 to 1918. At any particular point, your farm is going to tell some kind of story. And that's what's absolutely wonderful about Pond Farm.
And that's why if you're over in Flanders, please contact Stijn. And go by Pond Farm. And the great thing is that fuse that you just saw in that scene will be on display.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, you can touch it and not have to worry about blowing up.
What's that?
You can go over and touch it and not have to worry about blowing up either.
Yeah.
But it was an amazing opportunity, Stijn, to be able to, film your family digging up that pond, and there's numerous artifacts. We'll show a few photos as we talk here of we found coins, we found bottles, we found lots of bullets in perfect condition. So it was really a remarkable and unique opportunity to dig in the blue clay.
I'm very happy you liked that day. And I was very happy with those artifacts, and especially that I could find those pieces together with you.
Yeah. But there was one other story we're going to end on. We introduced the story in our first show, which was the special tank piece that you picked up on your property. And at that point, you were still researching it. So maybe give us an overview of some of the research that you did when we were filming Buried War on the tank and some of the information that you found regarding that tank that was on Pond Farm.
So we had some aerial photographs here from the area. And on the aerial photographs, you can see where all the tanks were spread around the farm. If you put that on Google Earth, then you can do the research, and then you can see where the tanks were on my property, on our own field. If you read then the regiment reports, it went over Glenlivet, and Glenlivet was patrolling here around the farm. His engine was overheated. They throw out his engine cover, and that's how I could find out it was the Glenlivet, because we found that engine cover, and that's why we were 100% sure it's Glenlivet. And then I wanted to find out who the family was of the tank commander, because in the regiment reports they always talk about the commanders, not about the crew members, only about the commanders. And then we did some research to find the family of Lieutenant Ryder, the tank commander who drove the tank here around the farm. And that's how we found him.
Yeah, so it was Lieutenant Ryder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who was the commander. And I think you told us at the time that he was only like 19 years old.
Yeah, they were all very young. And the most of those guys came from South Africa, and then they had to train in England to learn to drive with such a tank, because it was the first time anyone used a tank, and they had to train them. And everyone who could work on mechanics, who was clever enough, for example, to work on a bike, they had the chance to work on the tanks here in the war.
Wow. And so when did this tank get disabled during the Battle of Passchendaele?
Almost immediately. So General Douglas Haig, he had 216 tanks in total, and he used 40 tanks here around the farm. And they all started on 31 July. But they all got stuck on 31 July because it was so heavy raining, there were shell craters everywhere, and those tanks were useless here in the war. They mean nothing because they were stuck everywhere, their engines were overheated all the time. So immediately on the first day, they got stuck.
So basically the mud that we were walking through, or attempting to walk through, these tanks couldn't even get through it either.
No, and the mud sticks on your boots, and that was the same problem with those tanks. The mud sticks on the tracks, and then the tracks were spinning, and then it was hopeless.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times you don't realize how close it was where this particular weapon of war almost went the way of the dodo because of what had happened at Passchendaele and a few other places. Tanks were not an overwhelming success when they started. As a matter of fact, they were thinking about completely shutting them down and never using them again, which is really amazing. And one would argue Glenlivet kind of, fit into that without a doubt.
And the biggest problem is if you got stuck with the tank in the middle of the front and the Germans are shooting on you, then the British as well, because they said the Germans can't have our tanks, so we're going to blow it up. But there were still soldiers inside. And then you have all the noise around you, you have the heat from the engine. So it was like hell.
Well, I mean, so Lieutenant Ryder, 19 years old, his tank, the Glenlivet, got disabled in the opening day of the Battle of Passchendaele on July 31st. Then you found a family member, right? All those years later.
Yeah, correct. It wasn't that easy to find the family of him, but I found Andrew Ryder in South Africa. And luckily, because of you invited him to come over, and then I saw him for the first time, and that means a lot to me, because if you can find a piece, and a piece has a value, but if you can make a link with the family, that
well,
means a lot more.
We're gonna end this podcast. It's a 3.5 minute clip. The end of the Buried War show, but this is when Andrew Ryder came over to meet you, and we filmed it, and it's very, very special. That I think it's just great to run the 3.5 minutes. And this is, you got to understand, it's like you have spent so much time researching this tank, and it's been your most special piece. So to put it into context, just how extraordinary a moment was that we were able to get Andrew and you together, and he could actually see the tank piece. So I'm going to run this as is, and again, unless you're in the UK, you've never seen this footage. But this is Andrew Ryder coming over to meet Stijn to see the tank piece for the very first time.
Remember the tank pieces that Stijn dug up on his farm? The tank was called G5, but most importantly, he discovered that Second Lieutenant Ryder commanded the tank. Stijn made contact with the great-nephew of Second Lieutenant Ryder, and he's coming to Pond Farm today.
Hello. Hi. You must be Andrew, is it?
Nice to meet you, yes.
Hi, Dave O'Keefe.
Hello,
This is Stijn.
Hi.
And this is Stijn's farm, Pond Farm.
Pond Farm, wow.
This is here my own made cannon.
Then Stijn took Andrew into the museum. At first, he gave him a brief tour of his museum, including some of the special artifacts that he has in his collection.
This is my first rifle that I have found 17 years ago. That's an Enfield.
Wonderful.
Then it was time to show Andrew the tank pieces that Stijn found in his field.
I found these pieces, I think, somewhere 7 years ago now. Then I found another aerial photograph, and if you zoom it in on the computer, you can see even the tank better. And you can even see where the tank drived. Yeah, these are his tracks.
So that's my great uncle's tank.
Yeah, he drove that tank, yeah.
Wonderful.
So how does it feel standing here with this piece of family history?
You know, my grandfather's in the war as well. It's his brother, and just to be able to have some connection with them is just wonderful, really. Takes your breath away, really.
I think the moment that affected me the most is when he kind of walked over the little barrier sandbags and touched the tank piece that Stijn found in his field.
Would you like to go out and make a pilgrimage to the spot where it was found?
Yeah, definitely. The exact spot where he had to leave his tank, yeah.
Okay, let's walk in his footsteps.
There's just one thing, I've got a small present for you.
Oh,
Okay.
Maybe you can...
Then Stijn surprised everybody by actually giving him a piece of the tank.
This is something that I made.
Oh, wow.
It's the longest rivet that I found, and I put it in a box so so you can have a piece of the tank very close to your family. So that's very
that's wonderful. Oh, man, that will be treasured. Thank you. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Stijn.
That's part of the First World War. It's wonderful.
It's too important.
Yeah.
It's,
Well, that's part of your family history.
Well, for the family, it's recognizing them really for what they did.
Well, your grand uncle got stuck here with his tank in this field. He left it on 31 July, and then he came by foot to the farmhouse here on the other side over there.
So how does it feel now, walking in the footsteps of your great uncle? Literally walking in his footsteps.
Yes. So yeah, it's a wonderful feeling to be here, but you know, you can't say it's a celebration or anything, just a remembrance, really, you know, of what happened.
The journey really took him back in time, and you can tell he was really touched by this.
And it's all because of a piece of buried war that has now connected a family to a soldier who fought on the first day of the Battle of Passchendaele.
Wow. Oh, I'm tearing up. Yeah. That's why we do what we do.
Yep. Just gotta love that. You know, goes back to what we said in the first episode. Why were we doing this? And we can't explain why it makes people feel that way, but the fact that it does is well worth doing what we do.
It's just making a connection with the family, and then you can have a chat with each other. Yeah, that means a lot. If his family fought here in the war, I have many other stories outside Andrew Ryder. If you can make the link, that's the most impressive thing for me in my life.
And somewhere sitting on a mantle, that's a little piece of a tank to remind him every day.
Well, that's just it's an amazing story, Stijn, and what you've done to keep history alive, just by, you know, caring about what you're finding on your farm and letting people see it and sharing it. And you can go to his website, or more importantly, get to Pond Farm and see the tank pieces and all the other amazing things that you found on Pond Farm. But no, it's very special, and to see that again, it's been a few years, but oh man, it's so touching to finally, and I'm so happy.
It is, and still now for me,
I'm so happy, and I think Dave and I are both happy that you were able to, you know, close that story and be able to share that with a family, somebody who was in that tank on the first day of the first day of Passchendaele.
And then you went off script and surprised us.
You did. You could see by Dave's face, we had no idea you had that rivet to give him, and what a special piece, though, of the tank to give him. It was just great.
And it's very difficult to find the rivets. To give you an example, it took me now 4 years since I found last rivet, so it's not that easy to find one.
Wow. Well, Stijn, Pond Farm is a special place, and again, I'll say it. Please reach out to Stijn if you're heading over to Flanders. It's a wonderful place to visit, and there's so much history there. For anybody listening or watching, please reach out to us with any kind of stories that you want to tell. We do want to have people. We are coming up with future podcasts where people have reached out to us, and I think we have some fascinating stories to bring to the listeners of our podcast.
I think it's also a natural that we're going to have you back and probably do a lot more on the tank. Like we talked about rivets, we're going to get into the rivets.
Yeah, we'll give you a sneak peek. I'll roll some video as we're talking, but Stijn's also been part of a pretty unique project where you're taking a tank like Andrew Ryder's and you've brought one to life, haven't you?
Yeah, I tell this to everyone. It's an out of control hobby. I can't help myself. It's a
Out of control hobby?
yeah. I have no vaccine for it, so I built a tank, a replica tank, together with my old school teacher and some friends. I like to find the original pieces and then to find an old school teacher who had interest to build a tank. It's a whole other story.
And that is going to be a podcast that's upcoming. We are going to go deep into this project because we started filming this in like 2013, and it took years for Stijn and his team to build this actual tank that moves.
Yeah, I think 20 years and 7,600 hours of work.
Wow.
Jesus. Okay, that's another show.
That is another show. But you've seen some images now. Catch your attention. We'll let you know when that one's coming up. But Stijn, thank you. Thank you for sharing the stories of Pond Farm. And you'll always be a big part of the War Junk family.
Thanks, buddy.
No problem. Thank you, guys.
Take care. This has been War Junk, the podcast, with Professor David O'Keefe and me, filmmaker Wayne Abbott. You can write us at warjunkpodcast@gmail.com. And you can watch the podcast on War Junk TV on YouTube and listen to it on all major podcast apps. And to contact Stijn, go to the Pond Farm website. This has been a Northern Sky Entertainment production.